In today's video, I am covering a rather complex topic that involves different government agencies in the US, such as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and their impending decision on how to cover monoclonal antibodies which are directed against amyloid plaque for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And as such, these decisions that may be taken perhaps in the same way as proposed by the CMS may have profound implications on the future treatments of Alzheimer's disease and, of course, for patients. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or short CMS, is about to make a decision of how monoclonal antibodies against amyloid plaques for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease are intended to be covered by Medicare. In case you are not aware, Alzheimer's disease is the most burdensome disease in the Medicare population, and currently there are over 6 million older Americans who are believed to have Alzheimer's disease, and that prevalence is going to rise to 14 million expected by the year 2060. Now, this is the reason why CMS are looking into how this type of disease will be treatable, or the coverage rather, for monoclonal antibodies, and how they propose to cover those under Medicare. Now, I'm sure that most of my viewers in the US need no explanation or introduction to Medicare, but just for the purpose of completeness, Medicare, of course, is the health insurance program for US Americans aged 65 or older, unless you have a disability, in which case you might be able or eligible to receive Medicare benefits sooner than the age of 65. And so it is actually the role of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to determine which kinds of drugs are eligible to be covered under Medicare for the aging population in the US. And these determinations are ultimately done using a national coverage analysis, which then, upon completion, actually turns into a national coverage decision. So again, keep in mind that we are dealing with one particular class of Alzheimer's disease drugs. Those are monoclonal antibodies against amyloid plaque. And Biogen's Aduhelm is, of course, currently the only class of this drug that is FDA approved. But there are others in the pipeline. And so again, this does not apply to any other treatment modalities, really limited to the so-called monoclonal antibodies and amyloid plaque as the treatment target. Now, CMS are proposing to cover FDA-approved monoclonal antibodies under the Coverage with Evidence Development Program. And this means that in CMS there have to be approved randomized controlled trials that satisfy the coverage criteria in the section outlined below, and we'll take a look at some of those points, and also trials that are supported by the NIH. The trials must be conducted in a hospital-based outpatient setting. So, first of all, why do CMS actually make this proposal? So you may be aware that in June of 2021, the US FDA had approved a monoclonal antibody aimed at targeting amyloid plaque. And this drug from Biogen is called now, commercially available as Aduhelm. And this drug, though, in its approval by the FDA was quite controversial because the clinical data is not all that clear-cut in terms of this medicine actually providing a real benefit to Alzheimer's patients. Also, the side effects profile is not that great, but nevertheless, the FDA took a controversial decision June last year to approve it. And now it is ultimately up to Medicare, or it should be up to Medicare, to cover this. And because the safety profile as well as the effectiveness of this monoclonal antibody called Aduhelm is still somewhat controversial, The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, well, don't want outright to give basically the clearance that this drug, which is also quite expensive, will actually be approved, or not approved, but actually covered by Medicare. So in order to obtain additional clinical information to eventually determine whether outright this type of medication will be covered by Medicare, they are proposing to essentially cover these types of drugs. So it is not only Biogen's Aduhelm, but the entire group or class of drugs which are called monoclonal antibodies. And again, all of them targeting, or all of those which target amyloid plaque as the target. So they are proposing to cover those types of medicines under the evidence development, or coverage with evidence development. And well, this is somewhat controversial as well, which I will outline in the next few minutes. Now, of course, for Medicare, one of the underlying things to consider, of course, is the growing population of Alzheimer's disease patients, but at the same time also the cost of drugs that need to be covered. And Aduhelm actually had been introduced with a sticker price per year of actually $56,000. And even though Biogen have since slashed that price by 50% to now $28,200 per patient per year, CMS had announced a hike in the Medicare Part premiums of 14.5%. And this is now basically gone up from $148.50 in 2021 to $170 in 2022. And the reason for this price increase was ultimately a modeling on the high price cost scenario that takes into account the spending of Medicare funds for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease using Aduhelm. At that point, that was still done in November at the original price of $56,000. So clearly, the Medicare spending projection on Alzheimer's disease by 2050 actually is $599 billion. So it is understandable that Medicare, of course, need to make sure and ensure that the types of medicines they cover are safe and effective. And well, there is controversy on Aduhelm, but it is somewhat, well, controversial in its own right that CMS now propose to cover Aduhelm as well as any other monoclonal antibody, essentially under the coverage with clinical evidence scheme, as in their proposal here. So let's take a look at what the implications of that actually is and what that will mean. So first of all, it seems somewhat perhaps an overreaction or oversimplified to group all of the drugs that are monoclonal antibodies targeting amyloid plaque into one group or one category. Now, we have already outlined that Aduhelm has its fair share of controversy and open questions, so no question here. However, the national coverage determination is not on a drug-per-drug basis in general, but it is a decision ultimately on a group of drugs. So it seems somewhat unusual or perhaps preemptive to also say that all other monoclonal antibodies other than Aduhelm, which are in the pipeline and many of which are actually in phase 3 trials, where we expect data to come out within the next 10 perhaps to 18 months time frame, these newer types of monoclonal antibodies may have completely different profiles and much more evidence in terms of their impact positively influencing the outcomes of Alzheimer's disease patients. So ultimately determining here, based on one drug that poses some serious questions, to say that all of the drugs with this target will be covered under coverage with evidence development seems, really, it's troublesome and worrisome as well. So what does that mean ultimately when we look at what a CMS approved trial actually means. So any CMS approved clinical trial is of course a randomized controlled trial, that's for sure. These trials also need to include actually PET scans in order to image and visualize the plaque formation in the brain. And in terms of patient criteria, so patients must have a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment due to AD or mild AD dementia. And they must have evidence of an amyloid pathology which is consistent with Alzheimer's disease. There are, of course, exclusion criteria, so any other neurological or medical condition other than Alzheimer's disease, of course, those patients would not be eligible for these kinds of studies. They should not, be at the risk of dying from another disease during the duration of the study, and they should have, no medical conditions other than Alzheimer's disease. Now, CMS basically wants to answer and address a couple of key questions with this evidence determination or evidence coverage. So the question is, does the use of the monoclonal antibodies against amyloid plaque result in a statistically significant and clinically meaningful difference in the decline of cognition and function? And what are the adverse events associated with the use of these monoclonal antibodies against amyloid plaque in the disease treatment? And then, of course, there are the study requirements outlined by CMS. And, we won't go into all of those, but you see it is a rather long list of study requirements. I leave the link, as always, in the description below, so if you want to, you can take a closer look. But ultimately, lots of those actually are already part of any FDA-approved clinical trial, which really raises the question more so, why and how does CMS actually assume the role of, let's say, a parallel, clinical, sort of approval route besides that of the FDA? Now, we know that Aduhelm has been FDA approved, so by default or definition, it should be covered by Medicare. But, it is covered under limitations, namely those linked to obtaining additional clinical data. And in this context, CMS have never really clarified nor specified how they would interpret and view, let's say, side profiles or adverse events, the decline in cognition, or rather, let's say, the improvement in cognition, hopefully, and function as a result of the drug, how they would judge those as clinically significant. There are no, clearly defined acceptance criteria. And you can be certain that many of these points are also already covered by the ongoing phase 3 clinical trials. Now, there may be still some discrepancies, for instance, in terms of the diversity of the patient population enrolled in the phase 3 clinical trials. So, for instance, the fact that a diverse patient population must be recruited. Most clinical trials aim to do that anyhow, but nevertheless, a clinical trial needs to be able to recruit patients. And in this sense, one of the stipulations that CMS actually are proposing is, in fact, to limit these clinical evidence or coverage with evidence development studies to hospital or university research hospital centers or settings. We know that Alzheimer's disease has a higher prevalence in communities of color, and socioeconomic differences, of course, also here oftentimes mean that exactly that patient population, unfortunately, has fewer options or proximity to such research centers that CMS propose, at the same time as they're proposing to have or ensure a diverse patient population to be enrolled. So again, these are sort of opposite, well-intentioned requirements, of course, but how exactly they are supposed to be implemented is really not clear. And one of the key criticisms of these, somewhat not that clearly defined requirements is that overall this will significantly delay the availability and the coverage of future drugs that could clearly and dearly help the patients in need, where time will be spent and lost valuable time for any Alzheimer patient, while trials have to be either redone, reset, or discussed how they can meet actually the somewhat unclear requirements that CMS really aimed to impose. So without going into the legal implications, it is somewhat clear that CMS may actually try to step onto the FDA turf, or the authority that FDA have over regulating and approving ultimately drugs in the US. With the clinical evidence development proposal here, CMS ultimately seemed to question, or perhaps put into question, the decisions that the FDA have made in terms of approving or not approving a particular drug or class of drugs. So FDA do approval a drug per drug basis, whereas CMS proposed a plan to cover the payment for drugs, based on an entire class of drugs, so not on a drug per drug basis. And that, with the additional monoclonal antibodies in the pipeline, is perhaps premature and somewhat worrying as well. At the same time, of course, there's also the National Alzheimer Project Act, which was instigated and started actually to speed up the development of medicines to address this major unmet need and the looming, financial, envelope of Medicare spending already today, but certainly if we look at projected $599 billion to be spent by 2050 just on Alzheimer's alone, this act really is, the goal of this act is to bring to market innovative treatments in a as quick and rapid manner as possible. And again, the decisions, or the proposed decision by CMS, seems somewhat controversial and actually in opposition to what NAPA actually is trying to achieve. Patient advocacy groups such as US Against Alzheimer's Action oppose CMS's plan to limit Medicare coverage for FDA-approved Alzheimer's drugs. Due to the severity of Alzheimer's disease and the lack of appropriate treatment, it probably then is no surprise that 75% want Medicare to cover new therapies, even after they are told that the new drugs have a risk side effect that still requires confirmatory trials. Because this, in the end, of course, means that Alzheimer's patients have quicker access to those medications. And of course, those medications, by the time that Medicare should pay for it, have been approved by the FDA. That is the normal process, the way it should be. Let me know in the comments below what you make of all these pending decisions and how this may impact Alzheimer's patients. I believe CMS's decision is due in April. And I hope you found this video highly informative, either as an investor or from the point of view of knowing or caring for an Alzheimer's patient. In any case, if you got value out of this video, I would definitely appreciate you leaving a like, and if you haven't done so, subscribing to my channel.